welcome to episode 53 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whitten, here in Brooklyn, New York, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Seth David Radwell, who splits his time between New York City and Los Angeles and wrote a book which I just thought was wonderfully earnest, insightful, and thought-provoking called American Schism. How the two Enlightenments hold the secret to healing our nation. On the side, Seth has had an extensive and successful corporate career in publishing, skincare, cosmetics, technology, and consulting. So, Seth, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
Sure, Michael, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And let me start by saying congratulations on what you're doing with your whole approach, which is so consistent with why I took on the journey that led to American Schism. So, by way of background, most of my career has been in business. I've been an executive specializing in marketing in a number of industries. Was on the board of Direct Marketing Foundation for many years, and was in publishing originally with brands that your listeners might know of, such as I was the CEO of eScholastic. I was with Random House and Bertelsmann. And then I switched into skincare and consumer products generally midway through my career, and was most recently CEO of a company called Proactive, which is the largest acne brand in the States. Anyway, to make a long story short, so I have this long business career, but I have roots in public policy. My master's degree was in public policy, and I've always been a huge reader of nonfiction and a devotee to the public discourse, if you will. So that brings me to your question, which is why did this business guy like me shift his career to take on what is essentially an historical political tracing of our divisions, which is American Schism? And the answer is that I was growing increasingly disillusioned, if you will, at how our public discourse in the country had collapsed. For years, I had watched as the media models that were becoming prevalent were very much driven towards shock and outrage as opposed to truth. And then at the same time, I also watched my peers, my colleagues in business, private sector leaders like CEOs and presidents, executives. They were increasingly putting their heads in the sand. In other words, as opposed to engaging on important civic issues, private sector leaders would see no benefit in doing so because of fear of bringing on the wrath of some group in this day and age. So increasingly, private sector leaders were also not contributing to a healthy dialogue. So I said to myself, well, if reason and fact and truth is being completely crowded out of our problem-solving space, what does that portend for the future of our democracy? And it had become so disconcerting to me that in 2018, I left my business career to work on research, not knowing it would lead to this book. And after working for many years on some research and writing, that led to American Schism, which is, as I mentioned, the goal of the book is very much to use historical tracing of our divisions, which, by the way, have always existed in America. They're not new. But the belief is that history can act as a salve for our wounds if only we'd apply it. So I believe that history is important, and that's what the book does. It goes through a tracing of our history and then ends up with a plan, a program, if you will, to help us get us out of the dilemma that we're in today.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, reading this book, I mean, you obviously did a whole lot of research, but there's a very comfortable, like, kind of fluency in the political philosophy and all this stuff. Was that something you studied even way back in college?
Yes. So to be fair, I mean, I went to Columbia undergrad, and there's for those of you listeners who know, Columbia has a very strong emphasis on the humanities, and I studied a lot of political philosophy back then. This is like years ago, decades ago, but it obviously made an impression on me. And in general, I've always been a big reader of political philosophy and economics, and especially related, where this book ended up driving me, where this research led me to, of course, was the Enlightenment, which is so important. And I hope we can get into it a little bit for your listeners, because the Enlightenment gets a bad rap today, in my view, but it's fundamental for the progress that's led to the modern society. And so the book led back to the Enlightenment, and the schism in the book that's described is, in fact, a split in philosophy, a difference in two views that were contending for prominence in the political philosophy of the Enlightenment, which was called the social contract.
Yeah, and the what I found thrilling as I was reading the book was just kind of going back to that point in time, and I think you can look back retrospectively, and there's a certain, I mean, there's a lot of disappointment that, like, oh, the missed opportunities, but I think you also put it in the context of understanding, like, what they were doing was completely revolutionary. Like, as much as we might say, why didn't they include these groups or that groups, just the idea of a group of people kind of, and they never could do this. We never had like a blank slate to do this. The first
Right.
time that people had a blank slate and had enough resources and ability to claim independence to where they could say, how would we start a society from scratch? And they certainly missed a lot, but they were going against like the entirety of human history, which is where I think you had said it in the book, but people basically, you were ruled and you were ruled. It wasn't like you were governed, you were ruled based on fear, faith, and force, and that was it.
That was
And
it.
these
Oh,
guys had
right.
the audacity to kind of construct an entire society based on intellectual deliberation.
Well, right. So your point is right on. So today, given our perspective of where we are today, we look at the concept of the social contract and we say, oh, these were a bunch of white Europeans talking about, how they were going to be. It was their obligation to helps run society, and that's one way to look at it. But for a thousand years before the Enlightenment, to your point, your lot in life was fixed, and it really depended on how you were born, and societies were structured by fear, war, and hereditary
Yeah, and religion, right? They
religion.
use religion
Yeah.
too.
So right. So that was so as a consequence of those structures, it was incredibly confining. I mean, some of the times I give stats to make modern thinkers appreciate how important the Enlightenment overall was, and this new concept of how a society could be formed. I say, and this is also very much discussed in the work of Steven Pinker. Let's look at some objective measures of progress, okay, and go back 200 years, right at the dawn of the Enlightenment to today. So 200 years ago, across the globe, the average life expectancy was 30 years. Okay, today it's over 70. Right, 200 years ago, 1 in 5 children born did not survive till age 4. Now most do. And 200 years ago, 4/5 of the world were living in tremendous poverty. Today, at the equivalent letter, if you do the math and the economics, about 1/5 of the world is living in that level of poverty. So we far from solved all of our problems, but we've made enormous progress on objective measures as a society. Now, is all that due to the Enlightenment? No, but a lot of it is due to the Enlightenment, the modern society, and the scientific revolution, which created a new system, a new framework for how to get to truth and how to solve problems. Okay, so that really is an example of why this period of time was so important, and of course, it led to a complete restructuring, at least in Western societies. I argue in the book that it was important not only for Western societies but for the globe overall. But certainly the combination of the Enlightenments in America, France, and Britain, and Germany, and elsewhere, Scotland especially, created what were the dual revolutions of the 18th century, late 18th century, which was the American and French revolutions.
Yeah, yeah, and the other part of that, and it's interesting because I don't know where this goes, but the Enlightenment was, I mean, and I don't know if you address this in the book, but the printing press was so revolutionary for at least Europe. I don't know what was happening like in Asia or Africa as far as printing press, but it was revolutionary, and like you can kind of draw a direct line from the printing press to the Enlightenment, can't you?
Well, yes, so that's a great point. So let me talk about that. So the printing press, its first for the first couple of hundred years of the printing press, its biggest impact on societies, at least again in Europe, in the West, was to get people to read, because based on Martin Luther's Reformation, as opposed to leaving the Bible to the experts, the priests, Protestantism in its various forms required people to read and understand the Bible themselves. So for the first couple of hundred years, if you will, since 15 something, I forget the year when Martin Luther first wrote, the printing press was used to permeate the Bible and it had an underlying religious orientation. Now, that wasn't bad. It got people to read. It engaged people in a level of education, because before that, remember, most people were illiterate, right? It created a new level of literacy for hundreds of years. Now, what was different about the Enlightenment, though, so now you have this ability to print books, and it was mostly we printed mostly Bibles at that time. All of a sudden, starting with, and I think this goes back to really people like Descartes and Spinoza in the 17th century, there was this notion that, which is the beginning of the Enlightenment with Newton, is that human beings can learn other things about the world. You know, Francis Bacon and the dawn of empiricism was that we could observe the world and learn things and it better our lives. Again, today it sounds so obvious. That was a huge revolution. So what happened during in the Enlightenment, after those early thinkers kind of set this framework, is you had thinkers and I'll give you two examples: Benjamin Franklin and Diderot in France, who spent a lot of time using the printing press to write things like the Encyclopedia or Poor Richard's Almanac, which were intended to educate people on how to improve their lives without a religious focus, right? So the Encyclopedia of the 1750s, which was an enormous project, was this in-depth research work to be published, which is at one point banned for various reasons, that had no religious connotation, but it had a broad agenda of information to help people better themselves, whether that was about creating businesses, like improve their farming, like Poor Richard's Almanac, whether it was about how to solve problems. It used the printing press to go back to your analogy, to not for a religious purpose, but for an improvement in society. And
In particular.
that's how I characterize the Enlightenment.
Yeah. So to take, and this is one of the things that I've been trying to think about, because I was a history major at Penn, and I loved like the Enlightenment, but I think that what we need to, and I think there's the mantra of like, you study history so that you can understand the present. Well, it's easy to take kind of like what happened with the printing press and then kind of analogize it to now, to say what's happened with the internet is that now everybody has their own printing press, and
Right.
it's kind of unleashed this whole new discussion that is, I think it's uncomfortable, but like at least the way I try to kind of put everything in context is I think that right now there's a lot of people who have voice that didn't have a voice before on the left or the right, and there's a lot of people that were economically not able to participate in this because and they didn't have the connectivity to do this, but they now can kind of come together with people. And I think like what I would say is that one of the things that's maybe disrupted American politics is that you had disparate small populations in the more like kind of rural parts of the country that could never really organize because they physically weren't close to each other. So they just think they might read something, but they just think they're one of a few people. But all of a sudden you find that there's, amongst 10 million people, you'll probably be able to find 10,000 or 100,000 people that think like you, right?
Yes,
So
absolutely.
now all of a sudden that becomes a lot more empowering to your ideas, and whether or not they're right or wrong, people have the affirmation of a lot of people in their minds, especially who are like, wow, well, 10,000 people clicked on this article, so I must be right. And I think that it's a challenge to our education system and to our politics to kind of like, we're not putting you're not putting the Pandora's box is open. You can't close it. You can't put anything back in. How do we adapt to that new reality?
Right. But once again, I think history can act as a guide, because in the 18th century and into the 19th century, um, what now is called yellow journalism. And printing was used to create like the internet today, tons of information flow that was, a lot of it was garbage and a lot of it was opinion, and it what were called rags were all out there. People could read finally. So
Yeah.
they were taking all these opinions, and in fact it created, like we have today on the internet to some degree, an analogy. It created a problem in that it was hard to discern the wheat from the shaft. So what happened was an industry, an industry was formed around professionalism called journalism, that developed as a profession, like law and medicine did years before. I mean, in a couple of centuries before, medicine was mostly done by, I hate to use the term, but quacks, people who
Mhm.
didn't have any. And then with the scientific revolution, we made huge progress because we used a profession of medicine, going back to the earliest medical schools in Bologna and Europe, to create experimentation using the scientific method, which made medicine a profession. Likewise, in the 19th century, after going through again hundreds of years of the printing press being used in all different ways, starting in the 20th century, a new profession emerged called journalism, which had certain standards. Now, what we're seeing today is, in my view, a breakdown of those standards. That we no longer have news in cable TV. We have opinion shows, right?
Right.
There's no the media model in the internet does not value truth or verification. It values what gets the most clicks. And those things, I believe, can be addressed. I believe that the profession of journalism was important precisely for your point of being able to separate arguments that were based on factual information from opinions, etc. And that's what
Mhm.
grew up over the 20th century. That for a long time we've embraced, in my view, to a great degree. And I think that model has fallen apart.
Well, but there's one thing, and I think I even emailed you about, is that I think that what I wonder is that, do we need to? Is there a need for like a post Enlightenment thinking in terms of, you know, I'll make a personal example. Like
Right,
for the last years, I've been trying to kind of like start up this idea of like domestic travel and appeal to students, and I've been trying every which way to be able to get kids to register for this, and I
right,
haven't been able to do it. In the meanwhile, I've been, our family has been digging into a savings account that has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller to be able to subsidize this effort that I'm doing.
right.
And I'd say in the last few weeks, up until recently, when we kind of pivoted a little bit, like I was becoming more and more emotional, and I was becoming more and more triggered by almost anything. I could be sitting at the table, and my wife might mention something, and I would go off the handle. My daughter could mention something, I would go off the handle. I would, because I think I was so desperately looking for a solution and getting so frustrated that almost anything could kind of trigger me, so that I was thinking, I was emotionally logical in how I was feeling because I was frustrated, but I wasn't really thinking just logically. And I
Right.
think that what I'd say is, circumstantially, people are going to vary in how logical
Yes.
or illogical they are, by circumstances, and also just by how we're wired. There's some people who are a lot more hyper logical, and those become like lawyers and scientists. And then there are people that might be a lot more emotional, and they go into other traits.
Yes.
So what I'm wondering is that, in some respects, do we need to almost be thinking like logical, but also understanding that there is going to be, again, illogic? Like, to me, like, COVID, in some respects, you like, why aren't everybody wearing masks? But on the other hand, like, New York City was hyper aware of wearing masks only because really it hit New York City. Like, before it came from Italy over here, there was nobody's wearing masks. So once it hit us, we were like, oh, okay, don't you see the logic of wearing masks? And then we look at small towns in other parts of the country, we're like, don't you see the logic of wearing masks? But for them, it never hit them the way it hit New York City. So, not to say that they're being logical, and not to say that there weren't politicians manipulating the politics of the moment, but in their world, it just wasn't as pressing as it was for us. So it's completely logical for New Yorkers to be hypersensitive about COVID, but we can't necessarily expect other people to feel that same level of like kind of prioritization and sensitivity, because they haven't been immersed in it like we have.
Well, so there's a lot packed into
Yeah.
what you're talking about.
Sorry.
That's okay. Let me try to separate a few things. There's no question that in recent years, especially with the COVID experiment, or the COVID not experiment, but tragedy, really,
Yeah.
it became the political football that became uh, overlaid on top of this health epidemic was in many ways tragic. But there's no question that there were logical reasons for why people in cities might have to take different actions than people who are in rural areas. It makes total sense. And the notion, but then what happened, it became grafted on this urban rural red blue thing.
Yeah.
And so we could go down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
and
We don't have to.
maybe we should. But I think the larger point, though, is what you're saying. The larger question is really interesting that you're laying out. What you're saying is, I talk about the Enlightenment and reason and rational thinking, and in fact, a lot of data show that humans individually are much more driven by emotions. They're less convinced by data than they are by amygdala driven fears, and that's part of what makes humanity who we are. We all come from this primitive place where we are we're motivated often by fear and tribalism. Okay, that's true. But that's always been the case. The way we've adopted that in the modern society is by recognizing that we as individual humans often are illogical. So therefore, we have things called institutions, which help build a constitution of knowledge based on transparency that everyone can see. So if I say to you, this is a glass of water, and you say, no, it's not a glass of water, we can have an open debate where, we get chemists to look at it. Oh, it's hydrogen and hydrogen molecules bound to oxygen molecules. And so we can look at and then hopefully at the end of that, if I disagree, if you said it was water and I said it was not, at the end of looking at that data, I would say, you know what, Michael, you were right. It's water. Now that's how the Constitution of Knowledge has to work:
Right.
transparency and openness. Now we've used that. I mean, some of the greatest examples are in scientific journals, where scientists think something is true, and then it's proven not true. And so, all truth, in a way, in the Constitution of Knowledge, is provisional. It's based it's provisionally true until someone proves it's not true. And by using that framework of transparency and openness, we've made tremendous progress. And now let's think about this for a second. And this model, by the way, of the Constitution of Knowledge is a model that's been written about by a guy named Jonathan Roche. But anyway, the Constitution of Knowledge is like a funnel. So here's what I mean. One end is really wide. Anybody could lob ideas in, right? But the concept is that it gets narrow, because based on transparency, people review the idea and disprove it. So then, and by the way, the people who have authority to do so are experts. Expertise matters. You don't go to a garage mechanic to have valve surgery. You go to a heart valve specialist, right? So expertise matters, and therefore, on any given issue, while anyone could lob an idea into the funnel, experts who know that area should then review it. Now, unfortunately, that's what should have happened. To go back to your example with COVID, but someone like Fauci became a political figure, right? He became a political. We over politicized, unfortunately, in my view, what was a very serious problem, and that's true with global warming as well. I mean, there are many issues today where we have a lot of data that could be driven by experts who work within the Constitution of Knowledge to help advance our understanding, but for various reasons, political issues intercede. Now,
Well,
what do you do about that?
so one of the things what you're talking about, let's go back to your analogy of like the funnel, and we can debate that. We'll send it to a lab. We'll have somebody look at what you're drinking, because I don't think it's water. No, but there's an issue of trust, right?
Yes.
And there's
Yeah.
an issue of whether we're in this together, right? So if you send it to a lab, but I don't trust your lab,
Right.
then it doesn't make a difference. So to me, like when I think about like just say like the global, let's say the climate change, right?
Right.
So climate change is something where like the way I perceive it is I think that there's like lots of different perspectives, but I think there's also sometimes when we talk about the measures that need to be taken, a lot of those are measures that work for the person who's already advocating for it, right? So if we say we don't want any more coal mining, right? That's
Right.
easy for somebody in New York City to say because coal jobs aren't relevant here. It puts a whole lot of impact on a whole community, but it doesn't impact me, right? Now, if you say to that person in New York City, you know what? Flying internationally releases a whole lot of carbon, into the environment. We're going to tax flying on an airplane. So instead of your trip to Italy being $700, we're going to double that price to $1,400 because we care about the environment. People
Right.
might not be so keen on that. If you said, you know what, having a second home, you live in an apartment in New York City, but you want to have a second home and you're keeping that apartment warm, that place warm or cold, and you have all that property that you're watering for your benefit and no one else's, you should be paying taxes because you're consuming resources and you're
You're making up.
damaging the environment. No
Absolutely.
one is going to get behind that. So I think to me, some of these discussions are, well, it's not really like, well, when people will like kind of denigrate this argument as saying, well, you're just saying, well, what about this? Well, no, it's like we want to have a discussion. And if you're in, I need to see you sacrificing as well. I need to see you do something you don't want to do because you're telling me to absorb a lot of the impact here. But
But
what are you doing?
right. Okay. Let's separate a couple things because you're onto something very important, Michael. I don't think it's deniable that the planet's temperature is rising.
Right.
What it's due to doesn't really matter. It's also undeniable that coal contributes to the problem. So these are truths. These are at least scientifically until they're proven not true. So therefore, both of what you say are problems. The problem of the coal industry and the problem of people flying in the air and emitting much more carbon than they should. And there's an economic solution. So there's an economic solution that's very easy for this problem, actually, as a matter of fact. And it's a classic economic formula. I'm not saying it's easy politically, but the economic formula is simply that any activity that emits carbon, a carbon is what's called an externality. For those of your listeners who don't know economics, which means it's a cost that's not taken into account. So it's like a free rider. Someone having a home, 3 homes, is emitting all this carbon and not paying for the cost. Similarly, if someone's creating a watt of energy through carbon versus wind, the carbon producer has a cost that the wind producer doesn't have. Okay, so there are costs. You're absolutely right. The way to address that is in the economic model is by having a carbon tax. So that you're right. The person who's flying a lot has to pay more because they're emitting. They have to take into account their polluting of the earth. That's it,
Right.
as in simple terms. Now,
Right.
that is a very easy idea economically. And I could prove to you that if I had 2 equivalent firms in a capitalistic model where they were both producing, let's say, widgets, and all else being equal, if the carbon they emit in that process was taxed, they would both compete and work really hard to produce less carbon, right? So the market mechanism can work, but
Right.
here's the rub: the political economy, the politics of that is huge, right? So
Right.
we haven't we haven't been sophisticated enough as an educated society at separating out the political forces from the economic realities and
Right.
scientific realities. So
Right.
I think look, if we're gonna save the planet ultimately, both of what you said is true. We can't keep using carbon, and people who are emitting a ton of carbon that they don't really need to have to pay for it.
Right.
And businesses have to be accountable for the carbon they're emitting, so that it's taken into account as a cost. And
Right.
since in a capitalist society, profit equals revenue minus cost, there's going to be a natural explosion of competition to lower that cost.
Right.
That's
Right.
how we'll solve
Exactly.
the problem. But
Yeah.
but until we can come upon that realization and stop denying that the planet's temperature is rising,
Right.
we'd rather be in a like fight about whether climate change is real or not, or who caused it, or who's responsible. Those are all to me irrelevant. I mean,
Right.
that's not going to solve the problem, and that is in essence of why I've taken this on, because I believe that in the world, despite everything that you see and all the difficulties that we face, there is a majority of Americans and the planet, in fact, who are what I call the frustrated majority, meaning
Yep.
they recognize that the goal should be to solve problems, not to fight with each other.
Yeah.
And there's got to be a better way at productively solving problems, even if we disagree.
Yeah.
And so that's what brings me back to American Schism and why I took this on. But I think the examples that you're bringing up, and obviously this discussion is so important. And Michael, you're very thoughtful on these issues because these are great examples of the crux of the problem, in my view,
Well,
and what we need to do about it.
Well, the other what I found that was really interesting is you talk about like the radical enlightenment and the moderate enlightenment, and we can go in that. But and if you could go into that, would be great. But the point I wanted to make is that you talk about the importance of education, right? Which, if you then look at what's happening in the country, is both like I think a good sign and a really bad sign. Because on one hand, everybody tries to come to the United States for their college education, but
Right.
on the bad hand, I have lots of reasons to think that our education system is failing up and down the line. So, but first, could you kind of talk a little bit, just for anybody who's listening, about like how you divide up those two camps and what the
Sure.
differences and stuff?
So I'm glad that you mentioned education because it's one of the key differentiators. So again, for your listeners who are interested in this, and the book goes into it in some degree, this schism that I talk about was actually to a large part a difference between two views of society, how this social contract should work. Getting back to that, and most of the political philosophers we know from school, maybe like people like Montesquieu and Locke and Hume, they were what in my framework, which is the framework Jonathan Israel, who's one of the most well-known academics on the Enlightenment. Those are moderate enlighteners, and what does that mean? The moderate view is that uh, that human beings have these. They form a society to have a civilized construct that they can work within. But in that construct, in the moderate model, the people who should govern is just control the king are people who are educated, the elites, who know how to make sure the executive is not going too far, and who are well versed in civic ideas, et cetera, because most of the public is not well educated. And that's the model that very much created much of the Enlightenment. So people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, they were moderates who didn't believe in democracy. They eschewed democracy. They believed that the educated needed that government took the best and the brightest to be able to create solutions. So, and by the way, the book traces out how important this issue became during the Revolutionary era. So while the spirit of '76 was all about independence and freedom and revolution, once the war was over, we had real problems to solve. Like, how are we going to pay for the war? How are these 13 colonies, now states, going to get along? And so
Yeah.
people like Alexander Hamilton, a genius, came in to devise solutions to these problems. And in
Yeah.
his view, moderates needed people who were educated needed to do that. Now, the other view, the contrary to that, was very much the kind of the radical Enlightenment view of people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin in the States and Thomas Paine, which was that the radicals believed, and this comes very much from the French radicals, which the book goes into, is that the only long-term stable form of government in a social contract has to be a representative democracy, because people ultimately have to be represented if it's going to sustain. That was the notion of a representative democracy, an egalitarian government of the people, was a radical Enlightenment idea. Okay, now it the moderates very much believed that people couldn't pick representatives because they don't know what's good for them. They're not educated enough. But the point I want to get to is that the radical Enlightenment differed from the moderate one in not only its egalitarian approach, but in its belief that all humans were capable of being educated to a point where they could advocate for themselves and pick representatives. That's why for the democratic representation model to work, you needed to educate the populace. And where the French radical Enlightenment, or the French Revolution in its second stage before the Reign of Terror, went much further than we did in America, is that it recognized that in order to have a republic, the goal of the state needed to be to educate the public on what we call civic issues today, on non-religious. Up to that point, remember, religion was what ruled education. Education was mostly religious, and the French Constitution of 1792, before the Reign of Terror, laid out in specific detail, and it was written by a guy named Condorcet, who's a hero in my view, specifically what the government's role was in educating the populace on these types of subjects. And so
Right.
education became fundamental. And the truth is, as much as we might hate to admit it, if we're going to have a democracy, a government, an open society, we need our citizens to be educated. Democracy
Right.
doesn't work without an educated populace,
Right.
and this goes back to your point. To the degree that education is failing us in many aspects, our democracy will not sustain.
Right.
And that's a fundamental problem. I mean, when I went to school, and I'm probably much older than you, but things like, it wasn't just about a civics class. It was the entire framework of school. And I went to public school, was about like trying to evaluate evidence and make an argument, debate clubs,
Right.
thinking critically. And thinking critically is fundamental if we're
Right.
going to have a representative democracy. So I talk about this in the book. To some degree, I believe that our civic skills have been crowded out by the focus on reading, math, science, which is all important as well. But to some degree, that appreciation of critical thinking in the humanities is fundamental if we want to sustain our democracy. And
Yeah.
that goes back to your point about education.
Yeah, but and then to me, like I guess the shortcoming isn't just like the end result of saying like, look, we can't have civil debates, which we can't. Like we're not able to have them because either there's insults or there's like you can't do it. Like even and on top of that, like the cost of college, right? I mean, this is like the cornerstone of everything.
All right, but
It's ridiculously expensive, and
let's
and I
stop for a second. Yeah, let's
and
stop
I'll
for a
just
second.
okay,
Go ahead. I want to take a extra. So when you say you can't have, I say we have to have.
right?
So
No, I
so we
agree.
need. So in other words, it's difficult today to have
Right,
a civic debate or a civil debate. But if we don't, the alternative is horrible. So we have to reject that
absolutely.
model, and we have to force ourselves to be able to talk to people we disagree with, civilly. Sorry. Anyway, I just wanted to interrupt you because I reject the notion that we can have a civil debate. In fact, one of the organizations I work with, Braver Angels, brings people together of very different points of view politically to try to force a civil debate. I keep making that mistake. A civil debate based on rules,
Yeah,
and I think we have to realize that we need that. Anyway, I
right.
interrupted you, but on that notion, because I don't think we can say we can't have a civil debate anymore.
Well, so and I guess I'll say that I agree with you 100% that we need to, but there are things where it's like like all right, like I'm reading a book now by Sebastian Junger. This is the book after you, called Freedom, and there's a part where he's talking about freedom and like how like humans were wired to kind of like if you to when we go to war, when you have combat, you have to dehumanize the other side, right? Because it's hard to kill the other side, it's hard to
Right,
beat them down, right? So we have to dehumanize them. And to me, like when I've been talking to my kids about like using different words and what's right and what's wrong, right? I try to get down to something more universal about why you shouldn't say something, right? Because there's always going to be new words, right? Whether
right,
it's the N word or whatever, there's always something. And I was like, the reason why this stuff matters is because if it's a word that dehumanizes somebody, then it becomes easier to put them down. And that's not just a racial thing. Like every time I hear a person on the political left refer to religious zealots or MAGA heads or whatever it is, you're dehumanizing them. And I know that that happens the other way, but you're dehumanizing them to where you're not giving them legitimacy as humans. And it's a slippery slope to go down to where all of a sudden you don't care what they have to say. And then you don't care, you don't even relate to them anymore. They're just totally different, right? So,
but that's
so
part of the fundamental problem is that both
right,
sides, a good portion of both sides, folks on the left and the right, I call the wings, don't even want to talk to the other side. They reject
right,
it completely and call
right,
them things like woke idiots or religious zealots, whatever the
right,
case may be,
right, right.
without really trying to understand. That's the model that we have to completely reject.
Right. And then the other part to me is like the college education, which I think is just it's a crime how expensive it is. Like my wife and I both went to the University of Pennsylvania. We went to an Ivy League school. Neither of us we can't afford to pay for our kids to go to, we couldn't even pay for one of them to go. So how is the education system working at all or succeeding? And then on top of that, which I think is even more egregious, is if you look at how we prioritize work and workers, teachers get paid so little. They get paid $60,000 a year. Computer programmers, I was looking this up on like ZipRecruiter, but like, computer programs, $90,000, lawyers, $130,000. If we say that teachers matter, if we say education matters, we got to put up the money. Otherwise, we can't really say we're valuing them. And I think that to me is like one of the great tragedies, is that we don't value teachers the way we should. We say we do, but we just give lip service to that. We don't actually pay them what we need to. And for our democracy, we need to start doing that. And I don't know how you fix that, but there are plenty of people. Maybe it's the fact that the people that are at the top are able to kind of circumvent the issue. It doesn't matter if you have a lot of money. It doesn't matter that you got to pay $70,000 a year for your kid to go to college, much less private school. So if, as far as you're concerned, you can get around the issues. But
That's
for
right.
most people, they can't afford to do it. And the best you can do is have kids go into college and then come out with a lot of debt, which means that they can only work at the McKinseys and the hedge funds and the investment banks of the world. And we're losing all the talented people that could go into teaching, or that could go into journalism, or that could work on Capitol Hill, or that could start a not-for-profit. Everybody's got to pay off that loan. And I think like we spend so much time talking about silly issues or issues that matter, but they crowd out anything else, because as long as we can get clicks on that headline,
For
then
sure.
let's just keep going to that same kind of issue. And we don't talk about the things that matter. Like, we have not had an extended discussion about college education. We talk about loan forgiveness, but that's putting a Band-Aid on a decapitation.
What I talk about in the third part of American Schism is creating a framework to move forward. And part of what I talk about is that we have to recognize that one of the greatest investments from a capitalistic perspective in any endeavor is in educating youth. That the returns on it are enormous in terms of the contributions that later are made to society and the avoidance of costs like incarceration. I mean, the whole range of data show that investment in education is so important. So to your point, we are not putting our money where our mouths are. We're not investing at every level. Education at the college level needs to be much more affordable. It needs to be, I mean, access to education has to be fundamentally changed. So these are huge issues that need addressing. So,
Right.
and part of the way we do them, as I talk about in the book, there are ways to do them. There's a combination of solutions that some of them take a while. It's not going to change overnight, but there are many pre-distributive methods and redistributive methods that economics point to help even the playing field. So one of the things I differentiate in American Schism is the difference between a society that has equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunity. And I believe that, this is where I think a lot on the left get misguided. The goal here is not to have equality of outcomes. What drives the incredible American dream has been the entrepreneurial spirit of solving problems and becoming successful. That's so important. But what we need to do better at is getting people equality of opportunity, getting people closer to the starting line so everybody has a shot. Now, what you're
Right.
pointing out is increasingly, and this has been written a lot about in books like the meritocracy gap, and we're increasingly allowing the wealthy to pass on their endowment to their kids, while average folks are getting crowded out of the meritocratic race, if you will. They can't compete because they're not getting the same schooling. I mean, one of the examples, if you look at the data, a wealthy New Yorker who puts his kid in private school or her kid in private school, the investment in that kid's education is around $130,000 a year in terms of what it costs totally. For a public kid in school in New York, or even let's say a public kids student in Iowa, the investment in the kid's education is around $30,000 a year. So let's just think, if you take two kids and one you're investing $130,000 a year in developing that person, and the other one you're investing $20,000, and this accumulates every year. who's
Right.
going to win
Compound.
who's going to win in the race at the end. I mean, it's not.
Right.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist. So our goal needs to be to get everybody a bit more equal. We have to educate everyone. Now, I'm not saying it'll never be completely equal, but we
Yeah.
have to get the starting line closer. So the
Yeah.
notion of undereducating, and this can be done through redistribution. I mean, this is what one of the things that's become you can't talk about today is like taxing and redistributing. But the fact is, if you look at the work of Piketty and other economists, the top 1%, and this is where the populists like Bernie Sanders are they're right. The top tier of society has gotten richer and richer in all aspects, and they're not, in my view, they're and this would be a point where we could debate. I believe that the very, very wealthy are freeloading. They've used the infrastructure of the American system to great success, and God bless them because they've created wealth and jobs, and that's all great. But they also have to pay their share of infrastructure for their freeloading behavior. So there's a whole discussion economically about what that means, and we could get into tax policy and redistribution policy. But if you look at over the broad haul, if you look at the history of wealth and how it's distributed, we are at a point where there's some of the greatest uh, uh, imbalance, if you will, in distribution of wealth than we've had in a long time. We were moving over a couple of hundred years to have a slightly more equal balance, and of course,
Mhm.
there was still a huge imbalance. But we would get the whole notion of having the working class have access to more ability to accumulate wealth was a trend that was going through much of the scientific revolution through the early part of the 20th century up until about the 1980s. And
Mhm.
and and if you look at the data, and what it shows is that this neoliberalistic model that we've embraced in the West, and for your listeners who don't understand that, and I apologize for using the term, but our fundamental framework that we've used in the states to govern has been one of what's called neoliberalism, which is allowing for global competition. Right. So now what that's done is it's helped enormously in us being competitive, but it's left a lot of people behind because it helps it helps promulgate this imbalance in distribution of wealth, and that we've let happen for, and both, by the way, Republicans and Democrats
Yeah.
have shown tremendous disdain for the people who've been left behind, whether it's
Yeah.
Mitt Romney's takers or Hillary Clinton's deplorables. We and this is, by the way, part of why there's such rage in the rural America,
Yeah.
rightly so, because the global neoliberalistic policies that both Democrats and Republicans have insisted on implementing have left them behind.
Well, so here, this is something where I guess it ties to the Enlightenment a little bit, and this goes back to an earlier podcast I had with a gentleman who identified. I'm saying this using this term, but he's a Democrat in Southeast Virginia, and he said like I'm one of like 10% of the people here who's a Democrat, right? But we were talking about what the rural life is like, and he said like when he ran for office, the Democratic Party completely ignored him, right? And I think that one, and this is where I guess maybe it's like next level enlightenment, which is why I guess I keep referring to post enlightenment, but is like from one set of objective facts, right? It's like analytics with baseball and everything. It's like whatever it's looking at will say, well, it's not worth our time to pay attention to this rural part of Virginia because there's not enough voters there. And I think that it kind of almost reinforces a very short-sighted view on like what's going on. Like to me, like when you talk about corporations, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to think about this, but what gets exasperating to me is seeing that there are companies that can figure out ways to make money, miraculous ways to fix out make money. Like now you can just like swipe your card, and you don't even have to, you just tap your card and you can buy anything you want, right? But no finance company in the world has yet come out with a way to help consumers budget. Like
Right.
nobody's actually helping you save. They can track their own budgets, right? And tens of billions of dollars. They can help you buy money, buy anything, any way you want. But there's no one that has yet come up with a way for consumers to not overspend, right? Or it's like Facebook. They can come up with any number of ways to get eyeballs. They can come up with any number of ways to spread information. But the second you say, well, what about misinformation? Oh, our hands are tied. We can't do that. Really? Because you were just a miracle worker when it came down to making money.
Right.
But when it comes time to actually worrying yourself about your negative impact, or like you call it, the externalities of your business, all of a sudden you can't do anything. So I think to
That's
me,
great.
like, is the answer just government regulation, or do we need to kind of instill people with values? Like, do kids in business school or kids in colleges or kids, even at the high school level, do we need to start reintroduce people to the idea of like kind of caring about the negative impact you have on other people? Because I think that's what's really lacking is people living in their bubbles and not caring about the negative things they do. That's not my problem. You got to be responsible for yourself. And that's a really sucky society to live in, especially as we get bigger and bigger and we each have more power to do not only good but bad. I mean, shoot, somebody now can create their own nuclear weapon probably. Like, we all have so much power in our hands. I don't think we have the luxury of just saying, I'm just going to worry about myself anymore.
I think you make valid points, but I think the way out of the dilemma is it requires both what I call in the book structural changes,
Hmm.
because there are things that are fundamentally broken about our political system, as well as mindset changes. So
Hmm.
the value based, how we talk to each other and what we value, those are some of the mindset changes I think that are required. Unfortunately, the mindset changes will take more time in many ways than the
Yeah.
structural changes. But the
Yeah.
structural changes are equally important. So, like for example, the incentive system in media could be changed, but not only by government regulation, but by incentivizing entrepreneurs to create better solutions for Facebook. I mean, the private sector has a lot of ways to solve these problems. So, but some of the structural changes which would help that. If you go back to your example of the voter, the candidate in Southern Virginia who was, let's say, a central Democrat that the party, because the party wrote off because they couldn't win in that district. The whole structure of elections has to be changed structurally. And one of the things I argue for in the book is ranked choice voting, because the two-party system has a monopoly on what the ideas, and that in and of itself is a problem. So
Right.
one of the things I work for is ranked choice voting, which I think is part of the solution to breaking what's broken in our political industry. I can't get into it now on why that helps, but if
Mm.
you look at if you study it, you see that ranked choice voting is a much better way of voting, because people don't only get to vote for, once, they get to vote repeatedly. For if their first choice candidate doesn't win, their second choice candidate matters. And so that's an example. Another structural change would be term limits. I believe the data show
Yeah.
that elected officials spend much more time and money getting reelected than in solving problems. That's not what our founders envisioned. So if I used to be against term limits for various reasons, which I discuss in American Schism, but I believe now the data have moved to the other side that requires term limits to be in place. That's another structural change. Let's take another one, just in voting, gerrymandering. I think there's a very simple way of drawing districts electronically by radii, by circles around the county seat. We can have no gerrymandering and let a computer divide the country into districts. There are again structural things that would take away what I call impediments or misbehavior or structural impurities in how our government works. And
Yeah.
by the way, and here's another mindset thing: our founders believed that their blueprint for the American credo. So the American credo for our founders was the Declaration of Independence, and the blueprint for how to achieve it was the Constitution. And they believed that in order for us to really have an effective blueprint, it would have to change every generation. That's why they made it amendable. And we haven't amended the Constitution in a serious way in 30 years. So that in essence, we have to be willing to make changes to our governing structure. It can't survive forever. So again, I'm throwing out some examples of what I discuss in the book, because these are ways to start getting at the problems that you're articulating.
Yeah. No, you went to Capitol Hill to talk before some committee or something.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that and what you talked about?
Sure. So the I went. Well, I've done a lot of speaking on the Hill, but most recently I was talking to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and they have a committee that is very much focused on the problems of polarization of what they're seeing. And of course, outside of for the camera, many politicians speak the game they need to speak to get reelected. But behind the camera, most people, senators and Congress people, most realize that polarization is a real problem. So the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence is really trying to work in a bipartisan way to address polarization, and it was in that context that they asked me to speak to them. This is a couple of months ago now, but I've done other speaking like that. Part of what you're working on, Michael, with your program, is very much about how to try to get at this problem of polarization by bringing people together in various ways. So much of our history is characterized by great endeavors that we've risen together as a country to challenge, whether that was World War II or the Greatest Generation, or more recently in the scientific fields. Well, one of the things that we have to recognize is that if we really continue to not build a common hierarchy of values for the country, we're not going to be able to sustain. And so bringing Americans of different likes together and to better understand the different tribes we have today, that's going to be a fundamental part of the solution. And the Select Committee on Intelligence in the Senate recognize that, as do
Yeah.
many other governmental agencies. But they're not sure how to operationalize solutions yet, but they're onto the problem.
Well, that's very reassuring to hear. And, there was another point you made in your book where you talked about like some of the great transformations in human history was where it was really the kind of politicians address something that was kind of coming up. It was a groundswell. And I
Yes.
think like what I felt I was going to do on my own. And, it really made no sense for me to leave the job that I had to do this. But I was like, you know what? I was in the Navy a long time ago, and like I want to serve my country, and it seems kind of corny and maybe self-justifying, but like I was like, I want to try to do something to fix the problem, and it's been very satisfying for me. It's been very heartening because I don't buy the idea that we're actually polarized. We're perceiving polarization, and I think we're perceiving real problems that are out there. But I've been heartened by how many people want to have that discussion, which has been good. But I forget where I was going with this. But
If I can just
uh,
say that what you're saying is very true, and that is the hope part of this. I mean, I do
yeah,
believe that the frustrated majority recognize that we can't keep going this way, and more the groundswell. And you're referring, by the way, to the Farmers Alliance that led to the populist era, is
yeah,
again such an important example of our history, where a bottom-up movement, which was the populist movement in the 19th century, ended up forging a lot of reforms in the progressive era that were
yeah,
adapted both by Democrats and Republicans, whether it was Teddy Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson.
yeah,
And likewise today, I believe the groundswell is enough people in the frustrated majority recognize that we can't solve problems the way we're doing it, and we have to start changing how we're problem solving as a
yeah,
society. And
yeah,
that's the groundswell that gives me hope. Whether
yeah,
it's the select committee in the Senate recognizing we have to have solutions here, or whether it's private sector leaders, hopefully, that recognize they can't be completely silent when something is idiotic is embraced. They have to speak out against it,
yeah,
whatever it is. That we have to again play our civic role, because we're all responsible for our democracy. And what your ambition is not, to me, corny at all. It's part of the groundswell of the frustrated majority rejecting the way things are today and
yeah.
saying we have to make some changes.
Yeah, and what I'd say is just for you, as you continue with your work, is that I mean everybody that I talk to in my neighborhood, I'd say 98% of the people are, I think, hungry to kind of to get back to. I mean, I guess talking about like real problems and expanding at least the discussion. There's lots of things that are being addressed out there, but there's just a lot of things that are being forgotten, and we need to expand the topics, and we need to have more, I think, civil discussions about any of the topics. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. This has
So
been great.
yeah,
I've
yeah,
really
thank
enjoyed
you.
this. I hope I can come back sometime and keep up the work that you're doing.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and thank you for the great book. And it was a real thrill to read. So we'll finish by kind of showing everybody
Thanks.
the book again, American Schism. Definitely check it out. And do you have like a website or something if people want to see
Yes.
all the
So
other work you're doing?
AmericanSchismBook.com is a website, or the people can go to my website, which is SethDavidRadwell.com. But the book's available wherever books are sold, so you can find it.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, thank you very much, Seth, and thank you to all the listeners and viewers out there. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right. Thanks very much, Seth. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.